I remember the night I started my first graveyard shift at the old hospital like it was yesterday, though I wish I could forget it. There was something off about that place, something I couldn't quite place at first. Everyone had warned me about it, but I brushed it off. I needed the job, and it seemed like any other hospital, just with less action. The place was called Street Vincent's, a name that sounded too peaceful for the haunting that would follow. When I showed up for my first shift, I was greeted by Derek, a guy who looked way older than his age, probably from too many years spent in the shadows of this decrepit building. His eyes were hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. "You sure you want to do this, man?" he asked me with a dry chuckle. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just trying to mess with me. "Yeah, no problem. I've worked night shifts before," I said, but I could see his smile fade slightly, like he knew something I didn't. The first few hours were uneventful. It was dead quiet, save for the faint beeping of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses down the hall. There was a certain eerie calm in the air, but I didn't let it get to me. After all, I was just there to do my rounds, check in on patients, and make sure the place didn't burn down. Then it happened. At about 3 a.m., I walked past the ICU wing, and I swear I heard someone whisper my name. "Eli, Eli." The voice was raspy, like it was coming from deep within the walls. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, but I figured it was just the tiredness playing tricks on me, so I kept walking. But as I passed the storage closet, the door suddenly creaked open on its own. I froze again. The chill in the air around me felt different now, like it wasn't just from the cool temperature of the hospital, but something deeper, more unnatural. I stepped back slowly, trying to shake off the weird feeling. But then I saw it. In the dim light from the emergency exit sign above, I saw the shadow of a figure standing in the doorway of the closet. Just standing there. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice weak. No response. I took a cautious step toward the closet. The moment my foot hit the tile, the figure disappeared. Not walked away, not moved, vanished into thin air. My breath hitched. I was starting to feel dizzy now, like the walls were closing in around me. Then I remembered something Derek had said earlier. If you ever see something you can't explain, don't go looking for answers. Trust me. But of course, being the curious guy I am, I stepped forward anyway. I reached for the handle of the closet. The cold metal felt strangely alive in my hand, like it was pulsing under my touch. With one swift motion, I threw open the door. Empty. I stared into the blackness of the closet, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But there was something else, a smell. A mix of decay and something metallic. I couldn't pinpoint it, but it made me feel sick to my stomach. And then, from behind me, I heard it, a soft, scratching sound. I spun around, expecting to see one of the nurses or maybe someone playing a prank. But I was alone. The hallway was empty. The scratching continued, louder this time. I followed the sound, which led me to a room near the end of the hall, room 218. It was a room that was usually locked. No patients, no doctors, just empty. But the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Inside, the smell was overwhelming. It was as if the very walls themselves were rotting. And there, on the floor, was a blood-stained handprint. But it wasn't fresh. It was old, stale, like it had been there for years. But the worst part, the whispering, started low at first, then grew louder, more frantic. It was screaming my name now. Eli, Eli. The voice was no longer raspy, but shrill, agonizing. I stumbled backward, my body frozen in terror. But I didn't dare turn my back to that room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure. A tall, thin figure stood in the far corner of the room, staring at me with wide, empty eyes. Couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't look away. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room fell silent. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing. I was never going back there. But before I could leave, I heard Derek's voice on the intercom. Eli, whatever you do, don't stay in room 218. That's when I realized he knew. I didn't wait for the intercom to say another word. My feet were moving before I even consciously registered it. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, the sound of my own heavy breathing echoing in the still air. I could feel my pulse in my throat, like I was about to choke on it. Room 218. That room had something wrong with it. I could feel it like a weight pressing down on me. But that voice, Derek's warning, he had known, hadn't he? As I ran toward the elevator, my mind raced. Derek's cryptic words played over and over in my head. Don't stay in room 218. I slammed the button for the elevator and waited, my fingers trembling. The metal doors slowly slid open with a soft hiss. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. A strange pressure in the air. It wasn't the kind of pressure you get when a building's air conditioning kicks on or when the night gets too cold. It was heavier, like something was pulling on the very fabric of reality itself. I wasn't alone in that elevator. I felt it. Someone was standing behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I knew I shouldn't, but every instinct in me screamed that something was there. Something watching. I gripped the rail in the elevator, trying to steady my shaking hands. My thoughts kept going back to room 218. What had Derek meant? Why had he sounded so urgent, so terrified? Had he seen what I had? Or was he hiding something darker? The elevator came to a jerking halt, and the doors slid open with a terrible screech. It was the ground floor, where the rest of the night shift usually hung around, chatting, grabbing coffee, or checking in on patients. The halls were supposed to be busy, but it was dead quiet. I stepped out of the elevator cautiously, but the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't the usual hospital quiet. This was something else. I could hear the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears, a constant thump-thump that made my head feel light. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the break room. That's where I assumed Derek would be, though I wasn't sure I wanted to see him just yet. Not after what I had witnessed. Not after what I still wasn't sure I had witnessed. As I walked past the nurse's station, I saw a strange figure standing in the hallway up ahead. At first, I thought it was one of the night nurses, but this person was moving too slowly, too deliberate. And then, I realized with a jolt of horror, the figure was dragging something. I froze. The figure turned around. It wasn't a nurse. It wasn't even a person. It was a man, no, a body. The thing dragging it was a creature, tall, thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. Not anymore. The figure's skin was mottled, grayish, like something long dead. And its eyes, those eyes, they weren't eyes at all. Just hollow sockets that seemed to look through me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then it spoke. He never should have come back. The voice was deep, guttural, almost like it came from the bottom of a well. My blood turned to ice. I opened my mouth to shout, but nothing came out. The creature took a step forward, dragging the body closer to me. Closer. My heart raced. I couldn't look away. Couldn't stop watching the horrific scene unfold in front of me. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally managed to snap back to reality, the creature was gone. The body was gone, and the hallway was once again eerily silent. I staggered backward, my hands on the wall, trying to steady myself. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no way in hell this was a hallucination. This was real. I stumbled back toward the break room, hoping for some clarity, hoping to find Derek and get answers. But when I pushed open the door to the break room, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The lights were flickering. The room was empty, but there, sitting at one of the tables, was a black leather notebook. It was strange, out of place. I had never seen it there before. I approached it slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I picked it up, feeling a cold, almost electric shock run through my fingertips. The notebook was heavy, like it had absorbed years of sorrow. I flipped it open to the first page. Written in what looked like blood, the words read, "We all paid the price. Don't think you're exempt." The page turned on its own, as if a force I couldn't see was flipping it for me. On the next page was a list of names. I recognized none of them except for one. Derek. I turned to the next page. There were more names. But now, I noticed something even worse. The next name written down was mine. My fingers trembled as I stared at the page in disbelief. My name, written there in a scrawl of dark ink, smudged and smeared like it had been written in a hurry, or worse, written by someone who knew what was coming. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. My eyes kept flicking between the notebook and the empty break room around me, the silence suffocating. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't look away. There was no doubt in my mind anymore. Something was happening in this place. Something that went deeper than just a few haunted whispers or unexplained figures in the shadows. I slammed the notebook shut, feeling a surge of panic. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, like I couldn't get enough air. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But as I turned to run, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I whipped around, expecting to see one of the night staff, but the hallway was empty. Nothing was there. I froze, my pulse ringing in my ears. Couldn't let it get to me. I had to get out. I needed to talk to Derek, find out what the hell was going on, and why my name was in that damn book. I turned back toward the elevator. My hands were slick with sweat, the metal doors closing behind me with a jarring thud. I was desperate now, desperate to find anyone, someone who could tell me what I was dealing with. The elevator descended, but it felt like it was taking too long, like it was dragging me down to some terrible place, and I had no control over it. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted with the sight of the lobby. It was empty like I expected, but there was something else now. The lights were flickering just like in the break room. The air felt thicker, heavier. I could almost taste the electricity in the air, a hum that vibrated in my chest. I stepped out of the elevator, my feet echoing too loudly in the cavernous room. My breath was ragged now, every second of silence feeling like an eternity. The whole place was off. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the hospital itself was alive, and it was watching me. As I moved through the lobby, I noticed the security desk. There was no one there. The chair was empty, the monitor turned off. But there, beside the desk, was a small stack of old medical files. They looked ancient, yellowed paper, the kind that had been buried in a filing cabinet for years. Something about those files compelled me. I walked over to them slowly, like I was being drawn in by an invisible force. The first file I picked up was marked with a name, Derek. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to open it, couldn't, but somehow I did. I pulled out the first sheet, and my eyes immediately locked onto the date. October 14th, 1997. It was an old report, written by a doctor I didn't recognize. The language was clinical, detached, until I reached the final line. It said, "Subject has been exposed to anomalous phenomena that have left him in a permanent state of catatonia. Patient's name, Derek Wells." That was Derek. That was him. I could feel the blood drain from my face. Before I could process what I was reading, the lights flickered again, this time longer. I looked up at the ceiling, and I saw it, the shadow. It was moving, creeping along the walls, as if it had a life of its own. It stretched unnaturally long, as though the room itself was warping around it. I blinked, and for a split second, I thought I saw something horrific at the far end of the lobby, the outline of a figure, the same figure I had seen earlier. I slammed the file shut, my hands trembling uncontrollably now. I spun on my heel to leave, but before I could take a step, the elevator doors pinged open behind me. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, but I felt the presence before I turned around. There, in the elevator, stood Derek. His eyes were wide, vacant, empty, the same hollow stare I had seen in the room with the shadow. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. "Derek!" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. What the hell is going on? He didn't respond. His lips barely moved, but I heard him whisper, "It's too late for you." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen again, staring at him, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then it did. The room seemed to shift. The lights above flickered once more, but this time they didn't just flicker. They went out. Completely. Total darkness. My heart was thudding in my chest. I could barely breathe in the suffocating dark, but I knew something was there. I could feel it moving, watching. It wasn't Derek anymore. The whispering started again. Not from Derek, but from all around me. The voice was everywhere, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. You shouldn't have stayed. It was too much. I had to get out. I spun around, running blindly toward the exit, feeling the walls closing in around me. The doors were just ahead. I was almost there, and then the door slammed shut. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed in my ears, like a gunshot. My hand was still outstretched toward it, but it was too late. The heavy metal door was no longer budging. It felt like it had locked itself from the outside, trapping me inside the lobby with no way out. I turned around in a panic, my mind reeling. The entire hospital had gone silent. The faint hum of machines, the murmur of distant conversations, the typical clatter of night staff. It was gone. The stillness felt suffocating, as if I had just stepped into a place that wasn't quite real anymore. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from the direction of the elevator. I didn't have to look. I could feel it. Something was coming. It wasn't Derek anymore. No, this was something far worse. I forced myself to move, even though every nerve in my body screamed to run. But the idea of running through a pitch-black hospital, with whatever was out there chasing me, seemed like a suicide mission. I glanced around. I was in the main lobby, but it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in, the flickering lights casting strange shadows that danced across the floor. I could see the outline of the chairs, the reception desk, the doors leading to the emergency exits. But all of it felt wrong. The tapping came again, closer this time. I whipped around toward the elevator. The doors were slowly creaking open. I held my breath. Please not again, I thought. The air grew thick. The tension was unbearable. And then I saw it. A shadowy figure, tall, with long, spindly limbs. Its shape wasn't fully human, not in the way that Derek had been. This one was something else entirely. It stood in the doorway of the elevator, staring at me with those empty, hollow eyes. No pupils, just black. I felt my knees go weak. I was rooted to the spot, unable to take my eyes off the creature. I could hear its breath, a low, wet gurgle that sounded like it was coming from deep within its chest, or from somewhere far beneath the floorboards. It began to move toward me, taking slow, deliberate steps, dragging its feet like it was savoring my terror. In that moment, my thoughts spun into a frenzy. The air around me felt heavier, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. It was as if the hospital was alive, responding to something dark, feeding on the fear of whoever remained inside. I had to escape. I turned and bolted toward the nearest exit, my feet slamming against the cold tiles, the sound echoing in the silence. This wasn't real, I kept telling myself. This wasn't real. But my legs felt like they were moving through water. Every step seemed to drag me down further, as if something was pulling me back. And then I heard the whisper again. It was all around me, closer now. You shouldn't have stayed. I tried not to scream, but the sound clawed its way up my throat. My hands were slick with sweat, my breathing shallow. I was so close to the doors, so close to freedom. But just as I reached the handle of the emergency exit door, I felt something cold wrap around my wrist. A hand, a cold, lifeless grip. Felt like it was made of ice, frozen and unyielding. I turned around in a blind panic, expecting to see that creature again. But it was worse. It was Derek. But he wasn't Derek anymore. His face was twisted, grotesque. His skin had paled to a sickly shade of gray, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. His eyes, those empty eyes, were now blackened holes that seemed to reach deep into the void. You should have listened, he rasped, his voice coming out in a jagged, unnatural wheeze. Now it's too late. I struggled against his grip, but his fingers were like iron. I tried to yank my wrist free, but it felt as if I was trapped in molasses, the world moving in slow motion. Then, I heard another sound, a soft, scraping noise, something behind me, just at the corner of my vision. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't help it. I turned. There, in the corner of the lobby, the shadowy figure was standing again, just watching. But this time, it wasn't alone. It was surrounded by others. Hundreds of them. Figures that were so pale, so still, they seemed like reflections of the shadow itself. They had no faces, no eyes, just empty skin. And they were all watching me, waiting. A voice? No, a chorus of voices, whispered in unison. "You're one of us now." I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I was trapped, surrounded by these empty people, this thing that wasn't Derek anymore, and that creature in the elevator. I felt it now, in the pit of my stomach, the truth. This hospital wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was a place that fed on the living, on the people who walked through its doors. It consumed them mind, body, and soul, leaving nothing but empty shells of who they once were. It lured them in like prey and then kept them forever. And as I looked around, I realized something even worse. I was already gone, couldn't breathe. The walls of the hospital seemed to close in tighter, like the air itself was growing denser with every passing second. The figures standing around me, those hollowed-out shapes, those empty people, were slowly closing the gap. But they didn't move in the way that humans move. It wasn't like walking or stumbling. It was slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. My wrist was still caught in Derek's unyielding grasp. His fingers had clenched around it, and I could feel the cold seeping through my skin, like ice-cold needles stabbing deep into my veins. His face, it wasn't him anymore. I could see it now. What had happened to him? He was one of them. I tried to wrench my wrist free, but he didn't flinch. His body felt too heavy, as if he were being held in place by some force that went beyond physical restraint. "It's too late, Eli." Derek's voice was a rasping whisper, like it had been pulled through a crack in the earth. "You can't escape. Not anymore." I shook my head, my heart hammering in my chest, every muscle screaming for release. "No, I'm not like you. I won't be like you." But Derek's lips curled into a twisted smile, the edges of his mouth stretching unnaturally wide, as though it was a mask that had been pulled too tight. He didn't answer. His eyes, empty and blackened, stared at me with a sad, knowing look. I took a step back, and that's when I felt it. The ground beneath my feet wasn't solid anymore. It wasn't just the usual sense of panic that made everything feel unstable. No, it was more than that. It was like the hospital itself was shifting beneath me, like the floor had turned into quicksand. A deep, suffocating hole opening up beneath my feet. The whispers began again. "You should have left. You should have listened." The voices came from everywhere, curling around me like tendrils, pressing against my skin, sinking into my bones. I stumbled backward and collided with the reception desk, the sharp edge digging into my back. I wanted to scream, but the air around me seemed to crush my lungs. The shadowy figure in the corner, the one I had seen earlier, was no longer standing still. It was moving now. The limbs stretched unnaturally long, spider-like, and its body jerked forward in a series of sickening twists. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, sliding through the room like it was part of the shadows themselves. The others, the faceless, empty beings, began to move too, slowly at first, but then more quickly, closing the distance with eerie precision. Their heads tilted in unison, their movements synchronized, like they were watching me, waiting for something. I could feel it now, something that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind, something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a place of healing or life. It was something far darker. It was a trap. And the people who came here, every night shift worker, every patient, every soul who walked in, were nothing more than bait. The ones who never made it out, they became part of the building, their souls trapped in its very foundation. I turned to look at the door again, the one that had slammed shut when I tried to leave. But now it wasn't just locked. The door wasn't there at all. There was nothing but a wall. A solid, blank wall, like the exit had never existed. I felt my stomach drop. I was stuck, trapped in this endless nightmare. This place didn't let you go. The figures were all around me now. I could feel them, brushing past me. Their hollow, empty eyes watching. Their mouths opening, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. They weren't human anymore. They couldn't be. But one of them, one of the figures, was different. It was closer to me. It had a face. I didn't want to look, but I did anyway. And when I did, I froze. It was me. A version of me, or something that had once been me, staring back with eyes too wide, skin too pale. The face was stretched, warped, like it was melting. I could barely recognize the features. The shape of my nose, my eyes, my mouth, all twisted beyond recognition. But those eyes were mine. They were hauntingly familiar. And the thing, my reflection, smiled. "Welcome," it whispered, its voice like something from the grave. "We've been waiting for you." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I tried to pull away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Couldn't look away. I felt the thing step closer, its fingers reaching for my face, cold and dry. But just as it was about to touch me, I heard something. A faint sound, a click, came from above. Then the whole room shuddered. The walls began to shift again. But this time, it wasn't the darkness closing in. No, it was something opening. A faint light, dim, but real, shone through the cracks in the ceiling. It was a flicker of hope, something that felt like it didn't belong in this place. The figures, all of them, paused. They turned their heads simultaneously toward the light. "No," Derek whispered, his voice cracking. "It's too late. It won't save you." But I couldn't wait anymore. My body moved before my mind could process it. I ran. I ran toward the light. I ran, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. The figures didn't chase me, not yet. But I could feel them. They were watching, waiting, their hollow eyes fixed on me as I moved toward the light above. Every step felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to swallow me whole. The walls seemed to stretch, warping and twisting as if the entire building were alive, its heartbeat thumping beneath the surface. But I couldn't stop. I had to reach the light. The closer I got, the more the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were feeding on my desperation. "You can't leave. You don't belong out there. It's too late for you. There is no escape." I ignored them, pushing myself harder. My legs burned with the effort, my heart pounding in my chest as I neared the spot where the light was coming from. It wasn't just light anymore, it was a door. A small, old wooden door embedded into the corner of the room, barely noticeable against the decaying walls. But I could feel it, the way it pulled me in, like it was calling my name. The whispers stopped. Suddenly, all was silent. I reached the door and grabbed the handle. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. It made my skin crawl, but I didn't hesitate. I twisted it and pushed. The door creaked open. Beyond it wasn't a hallway, wasn't another part of the hospital. It was darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. But within that darkness, I could make out a faint shape, a silhouette. It looked like a figure, just standing there. I stepped through. The moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, trapping me in total blackness. I stumbled forward, disoriented, but someone, was there. Eli, the voice. It was Derek's voice, but not the same. This wasn't the hollow, empty thing I had heard before. It was familiar, almost warm. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the figure. The silhouette slowly stepped forward, and I felt the air change around me. I took a step back. What is this? My voice cracked, barely a whisper. The light was gone now, swallowed up by the suffocating darkness, and there was no way to know where I was. Derek stepped closer, but this time I could see him more clearly. His face normal as it had been before everything fell apart. He wasn't twisted. He wasn't dead. He was just Derek. "Eli, listen to me." I blinked, the confusion overwhelming me. The room felt still, too quiet. "You're free now," he continued. "You're out." I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I had escaped the horrors of the hospital. I was back. It was over. But something was wrong. My chest tightened. The air around me grew thick again, and my feet felt like they were rooting into the floor, as if the earth beneath me was holding me in place. What is this? I repeated, my voice shaking now. Where am I? This is the only place left. Derek's voice dropped, and his smile faded. The only way out is to become one of them. I froze. I looked around, the suffocating realization beginning to claw its way into my mind. The figure before me, Derek, it wasn't him. Couldn't be. This wasn't the real Derek. This wasn't freedom. I started to back away, but the darkness closed in tighter, and I realized the truth. This wasn't an escape. It was another part of the hospital. Another trap. The place was still alive, still feeding, still pulling in anyone it could. And I was never meant to leave. You should have listened, Eli. Derek's voice became a low growl. The darkness began to swirl around me, thickening like smoke. I reached for the door, but it was gone. There was no way out. The hospital, it had me. I was one of them now. I could feel it happening. My skin pulling tight, my thoughts becoming foggy. My hands felt cold, my vision blurring. I was becoming like the others, the hollow-eyed people, the shadows. The whispers returned, louder now, overwhelming me. Welcome home. And then, everything went black.